I do the bit of the warm-up and then hand over to you and the rest of the team.
Okay, recording now.
Great. Well, a very, very warm thank you for joining us today. And a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Sarah Knight. I'm Head of Change within the Student Experience team. And my sort of role today, I'll just put my webcam on just so that I can see you all, and you can see me. It's just really to introduce the webinar and just to set out a little bit of background and context. We're delighted to have worked with you on the Teaching Staff Insights sort of results and survey that we're going to be sharing with you today. We had a similar expert panel that we've worked with to inform the development of our Student Insights report, for which those of you that have not seen it yet, was published last week at the conference. It's available from our Jisc Insights service page in the report section. Today's webinar is very much to share with you the early findings. I know that Mark has circulated the analysis with you last week. A plea, it is confidential. All the results are embargoed until we release the report in early November. So please don't share this any wider. It's very much a chance for you to inform and the development and the shape of the report, for you to add your comments in along with the team that are working on and have been working on the analysis. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights. Today we have Mark Langer-Crame, who is our senior analyst for our insights team, who has been conducting the quantitative analysis. We're also delighted to have Tabitha Newman here, who is one of our expert consultants on the insights service. And in addition, Mark has been working very closely with Helen Beetham and Jess Moore from our insights team to again shape and inform the qualitative analysis comments. So we'll be able to share a little bit of insights from both, but very much want to hear your views, and also thinking about how we take forward the results from the report, the so what. And of course, what we do always want to push forward is how the results are responded to locally. So, you know, what are those national messages that we need to be pulling together to really inform developments at a local level to ensure that we can use these results in a meaningful way and ensure that the results really do inform practice and how some of these challenging areas can be taken forward. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to lead us through the webinar. Just before I do, a reminder to say, if you're not involved in speaking, can we just ensure that microphones are turned off, just so we don't get any background noise? And obviously, when you do want to contribute, just a reminder to switch them back on. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for that, and thanks everyone for attending on this rainy day. Well, we've got 1 hour to go through the presentation here, so it's going to be a kind of a double act between Helen and I. So we go to the next slide. Whoops. So we want to spend most of the presentation talking about the key messages and action points for providers that come out of the summary of the findings that I sent you late last week. And Helen's got a few really interesting issues to ponder at the end, the last 10 minutes. So what we wanted to do is go through theme by theme, so each of the four. I was going to sort of ask questions about the kind of the key findings, the key, I suppose, data, qualitative findings that were sent to you last week, and then Helen will then sort of ask you about sort of the key messages, the so what, the action points from those. So if we have a look at the first slide that I brought up, which is about teachers and their digital technology, on the left hand side here is kind of a quick summary of what we think are the main points to come out of the analysis that we think are most important. So I'm not going to go through these, but you can have a look at them.
Mark,
so
sorry, you just want to pop the, because you're controlling the slides, you just want to pop the presentation on full screen view, because at the moment...
Wasn't it?
No.
Full screen view. Oh, okay, let me have a look. I'm wondering it's because I've got... is that working now?
Perfect, thank you.
You know what it is? It's because the first time I've had a second screen, and for some reason it just stops it working. So learned something there. Thanks for pointing that out. So you can see the left-hand side here is the what we think is our main summary of theme 1, and then the key messages which Helen's written, and action points. So the first question is with the key findings, what you've looked at from last week. Was there anything that stood out for you, anything that's particularly relevant to your institution, that something maybe unexpected? And you can pop messages in the group chat, or you can speak as well. So we've got areas under assistive technology, who the teaching staff are most likely to turn to. I thought a very interesting question, the one about the people, what were they early adopters? Did they come in later? And generally they were not the ones who would be the first to adopt, it was most popular, but the ones that adopted when sort of after the lead, I suppose the lead people have gone first. There were very few people in the group who were further behind. So anything out of those findings that you maybe from your own analysis would be different? Okay, so we've got a few comments in here now. So John, you got a comment here about assistive technologies seem out of place, perhaps needs a free text box to say what they're using. Hi, is that John?
Feedback to someone else.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, it was just like all the other questions. The assistive one doesn't seem to go anywhere. It's just like, are you using assistive technology? And then it sort of skips on with all the other questions. Might be good to say, are they using what are they using? You give examples of what they might use, but what are they using?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Because in the student survey, we did have a question in there, then asking what they used as well. So that's obviously a signal there that we need for the question next year about what they're actually using, not are they using it.
Yeah, because it'll be interesting to know what they are using.
Yeah.
And if any way we can help them,
Absolutely, and how it differs, from students as well.
And I think the other aspect, and I think we've sort of touched on this from the students' results that are coming through, that actually it makes practice inclusive and accessible, rather than, I think one of the things I think would be better. Sorry, someone's got their microphone open. I can't work out who it is. There's lots of background noise. But just trying to work out whether assistive technology is being used in relation to supporting a particular disability or learning disability, or whether people are using it more to actually just support everyday practice. And I think that would be the really interesting area, because some of the features, just thinking of our own practice around how we might just be taking photographs of presentations, might be recording things. Some of those features can have dual purpose, and I think that's what I'm sort of finding, is that we might need to differentiate slightly more from perhaps.
Oh, I think someone's got their microphone on there still.
Mark, are you able to...
I think it might be Lena. I don't know, Lena, if you can see. It was a moment ago.
I'm just wondering, Mark, if you've got the powers to turn the microphones off for all. Might be easier, and then I can switch mine back on again. It seems to have gone quieter now. So I think there is something there, John, that you're rightly picking up on, that we might need to unpick that question a little bit more in terms of how practices are moving on. I don't know if anyone else is in agreement with that.
I was looking at the comments here from Kate. I wondered if the higher proportion of staff in HE taking support staff for support is indicative of the lack of the dedicated support being available in FE. Any questions there, or any?
Yes, it's Helen here. It's interesting to ponder whether that might be so, or whether the distinction between experienced colleagues who might be sort of digital champions and specialist support staff might be a bit more blurred in FE than it is in HE, or even that the culture of peer support might be stronger in FE. We can't tell, obviously, by looking at this data, but that's exactly the kind of question we want to ask participants, if you have any thoughts about.
Yeah, and I see a comment from Grace here that at FE College we feel the digital services team seems to be as technical support only. And Jasper, you said, yes, please unpick this further. I have some suggestions. Was that in relation to who they turn to for support?
Yes, I was just thinking that, Mark, it'd be good if Jasper could just put a few bit of clarification in the chat window, if he's able to, on that one.
Yeah.
I think it's also, I think in culture as well, if we are thinking about sort of, FE teams, of course, teams, I think they're generally, working perhaps in the same space, in the same shared working space, and that we know that staff, if they have got an issue, they may be able to quickly turn to their colleagues for some of that support.
So, any more comments about the early adopters? Was that what people expected?
I think that ties in with what we had in our initial pilots, Mark.
Yeah.
I think it's always slightly challenging, and we know we've discussed this quite extensively with some of our other work we've done with student surveys, is that when we have a survey of this nature, are we naturally getting staff and students who are perhaps some of the early adopters and are more willing to complete a survey of this nature? I know there's a lot of research being done around, how do we engage the unengaged if we're talking about students, for example. But, I think we have to, by nature, I think we are more likely to get those staff that are perhaps more innovative with their practice and are responding to this. I think it also then gives us some pointers around how we disseminate the surveys, how we encourage staff to participate. And I think, the underlying principle around all our insights work was very much to ensure that everyone feels they have an opportunity to contribute. And it's not just for those techie or the ones that, are the digital champions. It's for all staff to feel that they have a voice and that they can share it. Some of that might go down to sort of sampling and the way that institutions have picked particular, staff groups to respond. So just some thoughts there for me.
So a lot more comments coming.
Sorry. I think it's really important to remember sampling bias, but I think it's also important to remember that everyone thinks they're better at things than they are. I mean, everyone thinks they're a better than average driver, for example. I think we need to think about what the purpose of the surveys are and what we can easily change. So I'm really happy with the message that most staff who do this survey self-report that they are willing to adopt, and self-report in another part of the survey that they are wanting positively to use more digital. Now, in a sense, we can kind of say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But if we think about the messaging, what that means from the messaging is staff believe about themselves that they are willing and interested to adopt, but they express that there are barriers. Now, those barriers are usually things that institutions can do something about. We can't do anything about the fact that we have a range of different staff in front of us, some of whom are more capable, willing, interested, motivated, but we can do something about the barriers that they identify. So I'm kind of not too troubled by a finding that, lots of staff say they want more technology, and if it was there, they'd adopt it. I think it's more interesting to drill down to say, what do they say are the barriers to them doing that?
I think also there's that question. If you start to break down the different categories and look at the other questions, that would be very interesting as well. As to how people respond differently to the other questions, depending how they categorize themselves. Obviously, we weren't able to do that in this report because we're limited by space, but something you might want to look at later. Helen, did you want to say anything on your key messages at all, or others to invite comments about the key messages on the right-hand side?
I think they've largely been covered by
Yeah.
what people have said, and it's been a really useful discussion. I just wanted to highlight a different point, and this is just another piece of analysis we haven't actually done yet and need to. But there was a lot more HE staff turning to online resources, but things like on-demand video are much more available to staff in HE. We can see that from a different set of questions. What we don't know is whether the staff, we assume that where it's available, staff are turning to it. But what we don't know is, supposing in FE, online video, on-demand video resources for supporting your digital practice were widely available, would that shift? In other words, is it just availability that's limiting the fact that staff turning to online resources, or would there always be, a third of staff who would go online, a third who would turn to the person immediately next to them, and a third who would go looking for a workshop or a specialist? And we don't yet know the answer to that question. But I think what we do know is that staff need a range of resources. So it may simply be that the same staff turn to different sources of help at different times. If you've got a question you can answer easily, obviously you're going to go online. If you've got a little, oh, how do I do that specific thing, you'll probably go to a video. But if you're thinking, oh God, I really need to get to grips with this flipped learning idea, you're probably going to go to a workshop or ask a specialist. So, I think it's a really interesting question to have in there, but I think we need to do a little bit more work to understand the nuances. And I'd just be interested in what people thought about that specific issue.
Okay. Does anyone want to say, or I can see everyone's posting online at the moment.
I think those comments are interesting that Lena's posting there in terms of, looking for different places for help depending on the topic and the time. And I think that goes back to some of the recommendations we had for students, is to actually make the signposting of support, whether that be face-to-face or whether it be online, very clear both to staff and to students. So staff are able to know where they can actually get that help, because it will always be sort of just in time that they're going to be needing that. So I think that's another key point there.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to move on, just I'm conscious of time. I'll move on to the second theme when it brings up. Okay. So there's quite a bit here on this section. I think it's something interesting about that only 70% of FE teaching staff said they had access to reliable Wi-Fi compared to 84% in HE. Less money in FE for reliable Wi-Fi, Grace, yeah.
I think this is what's really interesting. I think, for us in terms of trying to champion better support for FE, I think the findings that are coming through from the teaching staff are going to be really, really influential, because, we know this is giving us some very clear evidence where some of the barriers are. And I think, in terms of sort of trying to have some of those national messages and to try and talk about that equity across the sectors, this is going to give us some really powerful support to really sort of hone down where some of the challenging areas are. And we all know that, but it's how we then alleviate better support, better awareness from senior leaders, but also, more influential areas, sector bodies, etc. So I think that together with the student one is going to be quite powerful for doing that.
Also, it's the low percentages for both groups about agreeing that teaching spaces are well designed for digital technology use. I think it's something of a theme through this report is obviously the teaching staff seem quite engaged, but are more negative in general about the same issue when asked between students and teaching staff in their respective sectors.
I think the spaces are a crucial issue, and this is something that is not new. I think we've always said that the learning spaces have to be better designed. Technology has to be seamless, and I know that we've got some great practice that's happening in our institutions around more flexible learning spaces where technology is more seamlessly integrated, but that's not the norm. And I think, again, this goes back to pointing out those sort of pockets of excellence where we know there's good practice happening in the design of learning spaces and what the impact that is then having. It would be really interesting to see whether anyone's run this locally that has been looking at more innovative teaching spaces, and just to see whether your figures are higher in terms of satisfaction than what we've been seeing in some of the national figures.
I think it's also the attitudinal. We've got the 2 attitudinal questions, the 7-point scale ones, and it said that 58% of HE and teaching staff and 51% of FE gave an above average score. So that's the first 3 categories. And 16% of FE and 14% of HE gave as below average. So, I mean, compared to the students that, maybe that was quite low. I mean, we're going to have to, after this, I'm going to have to test a lot of this, the statistics to test the significance for them, but there's still quite a wider gap there, as it seems likely.
Yeah, yeah.
Mark, I just wanted to come, there's a sort of cluster of issues that are coming together, and it's a bit of a blunt instrument for understanding them, but I would really appreciate some help with understanding them. And I think they come around the VLE particularly, and I think that is driving all sorts of differences that we're seeing in the student data as well as in the teaching staff data. So I'm aware that from the student data, it was very clear that universities, HE providers, were beginning to offer bundled services, including a lot of what we would think of as traditional VLE LMS services alongside other student services in a kind of app or a portal. And so I think that may be driving some of the high scores from HE staff about how much they rely on VLE, because what they're relying on there is kind of core services, access to content, their student grades, their student marks, and all sorts of associated bits and bobs. I think what we saw in FE from the student data was a hugely flowering, blooming use of things like Shobi and Google Classroom, and kind of what, small scale, very learning focused platforms where the emphasis really is on designing activities. And to me, that makes sense of the finding that FE teachers, which isn't actually in this key findings, but I don't think, but FE teachers are much more likely to say that the VLE allows them to do collaborative things and to think of innovative activities. Because I think what a VLE means is beginning to shift and change. And in FE, it means that thing that lets me design activities and quizzes and deliver them in exciting ways. And in HE, it's beginning to mean, don't record me on this one, but that rather dull administrative blob that provides, that serves everything in an important and integrated way to students. So I'm just wanting to throw that out there a little bit as to how useful that term is if the practice around it is becoming more diverse.
I was taking a comment here from Kate as well about obviously teaching staff as well have experience of working in other institutions. They have something to compare against. Also, a lot of teaching staff, especially if they're doing very vocational areas, have experience of working outside of the education sectors. So obviously the student experience is much more limited, which obviously explains some of the different results and levels of satisfaction. You see the comments are still coming in.
I think one of the points we need to be cautious of, Mark, on that first point there around lecture capture and FE, is that lecture capture is not something that is widespread in FE. So we wouldn't be expecting to see, good responses there. As we've just been discussing, it's just a very different sort of way of teaching in FE, where lecture capture is not a significant requirement as yet. So I think, and similarly in terms of ebooks and e-journals, again, there are going to be perhaps we would expect to see in some cases perhaps lower responses in some cases to e-journals in FE again. So I think we also just need to be slightly cautious around how we report on those in the report. Because as we say, it's very much dependent on those differences in terms of the practice and in terms of expectations as well.
So I can either take that bullet point out, or we can give some kind of caveat to it as well.
We could separate that out, just I think, in terms of what what I mean, that, you know, we know that the sort of reliable Wi-Fi may be a significant issue for FE, but when we're talking about lecture capture, e-journals, and also video-based training, because the video-based training tended to, or we may assume that that sort of ties in with sort of large license or subscription-based services like LinkedIn Learning, and of course for FE again, they just wouldn't be able to have the resources to fund those subscriptions.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting as well, just to keep in mind the finding that in terms of access only, staff universally express that they have better access to things than students do. But as we'll see, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily happier than students, which is an interesting thing to bear in mind. And we've started to speculate about why that might be. And I agree with most of what people have been saying about that. And it's also worth noting that staff that have been in longer service tend to become more, or have been in their role longer, tend to be more, I would call it discriminating, but perhaps disillusioned. And they would be the staff that would tend to have had more opportunities to perhaps see behind the curtain, as Kate said. I love that phrase, or even to compare what they've got now with things they might have known in other places. So well worth thinking that. I think the positive to take from that is that teaching staff have this huge resource of ideas about how things could be better, which are often better informed than students' ideas about how things could be better. So passionate though we are about the student voice, we really need to recognise that staff, and staff at all stages in their careers, not just those shiny, happy, very digitally adept staff that are in their early careers, have something to say about how things could be better. And I think that's a really positive story to take on.
Yeah. Oh, someone's telephone. Right. Any other comments on the findings before we move on to theme 3?
I suppose just lastly, Mark, just that comment about not enough computers, old computers, out-of-date software. You know, I think, again, I know that's got in brackets FE, but I do think that there is, similarly with students, that although we all have our own devices that we tend to bring in, and, you know, some of us may or may not use for work purposes, I think in both students and staff, we're still seeing that expectation that there is access and easy access to a range of devices on campus. And I think that that's still an important message that we need to be reiterating, that, you know, staff especially need to have access, you know, to good quality equipment in order to be able to keep themselves upskilled and be able to grow in that confidence of use.
Yeah. There's a comment from Grace and Fiona that we'd like the term audio-visual that needs to be defined. So do we feel the question itself needs some unpacking there? I don't know, Grace, you want to say more? Let me make a note of that particular one. Okay. So moving on to theme 3. Okay. I think the interesting one for me here that stands out was the 87% of FE and 74% of HE teachers never teach in a live online environment. Maybe that was something to be expected in the sector, me being relatively new, but it surprised me. Or there's the other finding that around half of both FE and HE teachers never discuss teaching issues online. That might be just established practice. I don't know whether, Helen, you can say more about that, whether it's something that's changing slowly in the sector from a low base.
I will when I finish typing a comment.
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry, I can't do two things at once at the moment. I'll come back in a sec.
I mean, I suppose that's an interesting one, because I think that if we are expecting our students to be using an online environment, an online environment could be you know, working together collaboratively on a shared Google Doc. You know, it could, when we talk about online, I think we're seeing online not as purely online learning, but just in terms of having online interactions, you know, thinking about what we're doing now, you know, participating in a webinar, you know, whether we're using Teams to have meetings or discussions, you know, I think those are quite indicative, again, of some of the features we were having through from the student report in terms of preparing students for a workplace. And, you know, if staff are not able to perhaps teach in a live online environment or discuss teaching issues online, you know, that if we're asking our students to do this, perhaps, you know, that's where some of the issues around digital skills are coming in, because maybe it's how staff are interpreting this question. But, you know, if we're not giving staff the opportunity of not delivering a whole course online, but, you know, using the technology where it's having benefits, where it's having affordances, then that is not then progressing, you know, staff's own digital skills and their confidence. So I think those two are, you know, interesting and worrying, I would say, in some cases.
So we're just going through quite a few comments that have come in.
I thought it was quite interesting, the difference between teachers and students using digital technology. Teachers want to use more and students want to use less.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Mm.
There is the teachers generally are quite positive about it. It almost feels like they're being restricted, or as we see in stuff, not having, I think next slide back, not having enough time or reward to carry out the activities.
Yeah, I think the students here, I think they pay a lot of money for their time with the lecturers, and I think they want a bit more time with them and less remote time with them, I guess.
Yeah, the technology can't be a substitute itself for face-to-face.
And I think it's, you know, I think that's where, you know, so much of this goes back to staff having the expectations of the opportunities that technology can offer, because it's not about replacement. It should be about, you know, supporting and adding the benefits. You know, if you're thinking of you know, bringing in guest speakers on particular topics remotely, I mean, there are so many opportunities that technology can offer. And I think, you know, again, it's making sure that staff are aware of those possibilities and how they can build that into their, you know, to their curriculum design. So yes, I think it's really interesting that staff are keen and want to do it, but, you know, some of these barriers that we've just been speaking about are perhaps in the way of them doing that easily. In fact, that one around teaching online as a minority activity at time to scale up. I mean, I think it was just going back to what I was just saying, that it's not actually seeing we are replacing face-to-face, but it's more looking at opportunities that staff can build into their curriculum design and their courses around where there are opportunities that they can do things online that are going to develop the skills of those learners accordingly for the workplace.
Lena's your comment, which Helen's replied to, about staff say they need to use more. Students don't know what more is, so they say the same.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think staff very much realise that there is potential there, whereas students have, I mean, I think in all our work with students over the years, they have slightly lower expectations and more traditional coming in from, you know, their prior experiences of learning. So we're less likely to challenge, you know, the current sort of status quo, unless they're in an environment where, you know, there is a sort of clear pedagogical stance or clear difference in terms of the teaching experience they're getting.
I think Lena's comment here found it puzzling that staff ask the students less quizzes than students answer. I'm just thinking about there. Does that mean that some staff use quizzes so much that it skews the data?
Hello, Mark. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Ah, don't know what went there. Yeah, I think probably it's because students have lots of different teachers, so they may experience that they're having quizzes, and they do love quizzes when they have them. So they may be experiencing that they do have quizzes, even if only a minority of staff are using them. I think I think the thing about teaching online, it was a very specific question, which was about teaching in a live online environment. And I think you'd probably expect that to be a minority activity. What's interesting, though, is that, you know, some years ago, a lot of universities particularly, and some colleges were really trying to move into online provision, weren't they? And that's been a less important strategic objective. But if there was a desire to scale that back up again, we would be starting from a very low base of experience and expertise. And I think it's kind of interesting to notice that. But one of the things that I particularly noticed was how much more likely teaching staff were to look online for teaching resources, which you know, about half of them do weekly or more, than they were to do anything else about sharing ideas or developing their thinking. And that corresponds absolutely with students who spend far more time looking for learning stuff online than they do any of the collaborative stuff. And I feel that the kind of whole social web, you know, the whole social web movement is very slightly passed by in terms of professional development. There are very few teaching staff who naturally go to online communities or to Twitter or to online journals and blog posts, and you know, it seems to be the main thing they do is think, I've got something to teach, let's go and look online for teaching resources. So I'm just wondering whether there are things we can do to make sure that activity of looking for or sharing teaching resources is as rich as it possibly can be and as available as it can be. So, you know, that resources we share have a bit of context with them, or, you know, we share them in networks where there's some discussion going on around them, or just some, you know, it's back to the whole OER movement, isn't it? Of like, how can we share these resources that are so reusable and so useful, but without losing the sense that there's a community here, we have some contextual understanding, we want to engage with each other. And that sort of, you know, surfaced for me again as an interesting question.
Sort of Mark and Helen, there was sort of two comments that sort of do tie together, I think from Liz and also from Hertfordshire, about the nature of the questionnaire, that in terms of placing the focus on technology is perhaps part of the issue. I don't know if it's worth Liz or Hertfordshire just saying a little bit more around their comments on that one. Or if not, we might want to go back to if Liz or wants to email us something through, that would be really useful. Because
we're getting loads of useful comments here. They're racing, trying to keep up reading them at the same time as. I
know.
It's going to be very useful going back over them. I think what I'm thinking is on a bigger view here is that we're looking at the teaching staff survey, but where possible, we're comparing them to students. And we've got to be very careful, haven't we? But they come from they're very different groups who may look at the same question very differently. That, you know, it's gives us something very rich to compare the two, but we have to be cautious as well.
We have to be very cautious, Mark, but I think one thing that is fairly robust is that although the quality of infrastructure in FE is obviously lower, we can see that, we see it in the survey, we know it from, you know, the levels of investment and the size of the institutions, yet we still see that teachers in FE typically do more digital activities with their students, and students in FE say that they do more digital activities in their courses. You know, it's not just a unicorn that FE teachers are riding. It really seems to be reflected in the student experience. So there's a very interesting question there about why that should be. Is it the particular kind of activities we're asking about that may be more done in FE than in HE, whereas in HE they might be much more focused on uploading a brilliant recorded lecture and some lecture slides, and that maybe doesn't get reflected in the questions we're asking? Or is it that the culture of FE, you know, being much more focused on perhaps on sharing practice at quite a local level, has fostered a more positive practice around digital? It'd be really interesting to explore. If we can't do that with the survey, obviously we need some much more participative and qualitative work, but I'd be interested in what people think of that.
Hi, it's Karen here from Hertfordshire. I'm sorry, it's my username from Hertfordshire, the KB12 thing, but my name is Karen, and Sarah asked for some comments about, I'd made a comment about the wording of the question. The reason I'm saying that is I think the question's asking about the technology. Are you carrying out quite specific things, live polls or quizzes in class, for example? And I commented, if you'd asked the question, do you make use of formative quizzes or questions, you would have had a much higher response from my institution for sure. Might not be live, but they are used, for example, as a follow-up to a lecture or as a formative exercise, as homework and so on. So staff may be using the tools, but not specifically in the way the question is worded. Same with using digital systems to give personalised feedback. Most of our staff mark online and provide their feedback online in the assignment system, and it's way more than 20%. And in my institution, I think that the response to that question was slightly higher, but not as high as expected, because I think of the way the system, and I have a feeling that people thought it meant something different from the assignment system, perhaps using audio feedback or video feedback, some more complicated tool than actually the simple bit of, I generally mark online and all my feedback is provided through the VLE. So I'm just a bit dubious about the wording of that question, perhaps, or those questions, that set, underrepresenting the use of some of this.
So we're going to have to think about the question. Helen, did you want to come into that? Thanks, that's really useful, because obviously we're looking at the questions, revising the questions this year.
Yes, we have this every year, and I'm not dismissing it at all. We always need to look better at the questions. I think the problem we have with this being a survey, and we always have to be very modest about what a survey can do, is if we make the question complex enough to capture the range of practice, it's too complex for people to answer quickly and easily and to move on through. So what we do every year is we select practices that seem, particularly from the free text data, to be indicative of that something is going on. So, staff that are using polling in class, that's a very common practice. It's not the only practice that you might do, but we might think, well, if staff, if enough staff are doing that, it sort of indicates that some kinds of interactive practice are going on. We designed the question about interactive feedback really, really carefully, because we didn't just want it to mean, oh, I use the online assessment system. We wanted it to mean that something went a bit beyond that. Now, obviously, the main purpose of this tool is for institutions to use. It's not for us to use to judge institutions or for institutions to compare themselves in any way. So if you know that your practice doesn't support that happening, that's your answer in a way. But I do appreciate that need to explain away, low levels of some of this stuff. We have to always balance producing something that's really easy for people to answer, that is a concrete practice they can visualize and go, oh yes, I can see myself doing that. Yes, I did that last week. Versus, do you use any technology to do formative assessment, which then we might then have to say, for example, providing audio tracks, those are less well answered. But obviously we have to balance that out. And if we've got that balance wrong and we're asking something that is really done very rarely, of course we need to revisit that and we need to get it right. And we appreciate all the help in getting it right. We are never going to be able to encompass every activity that takes place in a space, though, just because we have to write answerable questions.
Thanks, Helen. I mean, it's a linked question or linked response from Kate about the feedback question. As you said, in HE, doing the feedback may come in blocks rather than doing, at certain times of the year, rather than doing it on a weekly or monthly basis. And again, it's that thing where we're restricted by the kind of question we can ask. And how do we best pick that up? Okay, I'm going to move on to slide theme 4, so I'm conscious of time. So this is sort of kind of what we're talking about here, about teaching staff maybe not appreciating that they receive the reward or recognition, very low percentages. Also having the time and support to innovate. So we've got that sign where they want to use digital more, but we're seeing here, of course, that actually their ability to be able to do it in their packed workload is limited. And they count the qualitative findings as well.
I think to me, Mark, this is the most influential set of findings.
Yeah.
Because particularly if you correlate that with the research that's coming through from the student report around digital skills, particularly if you correlate it with our work we're doing on digital capability. You know, reward and recognition is an essential incentive if we do want staff to innovate with their practice. And some of these findings, I think, I hope, will be quite a reality check, perhaps for some institutions that are not recognising that the investment in staff needs to be made.
And recognise at a higher level, you know, this report is looked at, you know, within government or certain policy circles, that, you know, that staff need to be enabled to do their job and with, you know, and use digital. And
I think that particularly that stat around 26% of FE teaching staff and 16 of HE agree that they've been informed about their responsibilities in relation to assistive and adaptive technologies, which is quite concerning, thinking about the new accessibility legislation that we are all compliant to.
Yeah.
So there are some sort of clear ones here that you know, should be raising alarm.
I thought it was interesting the contrast between the HE teaching staff, where only 18% felt that they were informed about their responsibility to students to stay safe online.
I know.
43% of HE students felt the university helped them stay safe. Of course, teaching staff are not the only people responsible for that, but it's still quite interesting, the contrast.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, obviously, again, we are seeing in FE that there is, you know, there's a much higher awareness around keeping students safe online.
I wonder if any comments as to why that is, or
just because for colleges they would need, in some cases, be having students from the age of 16. So,
of course, yeah.
And safeguarding and online safety is one of the key areas certainly in England, within the Ofsted framework. So in terms of quality assurance, that's one of the key regulatory areas.
Yeah, I think that final bullet point on the left, the one about, but it's a 7-point scale question asking about how staff rated the support they received and their organisation developed their digital aspects of their role. The percentage who gave an above average score, to me, seems very, very low. And again, that's kind of summing up and kind of encompassing that question, all the things we're seeing in the survey.
Yeah. Some interesting comments just coming through in the chat. I mean, Stephen, I know you're saying HE staff probably don't see safety as their responsibility, but I think if we're talking about, again, preparing students to be aware of their digital identity, of making sure that they are behaving appropriately online, particularly as they move into the workplace, I don't think we can ignore that. I think we all have a responsibility to ensure all staff and all students are aware of the dangers and the issues in relation to that.
Thanks, Lena. Some useful comments there about framing questions about the purpose of technology. Helen, do you want to come in on those? Are you writing at the moment?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Ah, cool. I think that refers to the issues on the previous slide, but I mean, you know, we would all love to ask more deep and meaningful questions in this space. We have got to think about, you know, the drop-off rate we get as soon as we ask those kind of questions. But it may be that we could ask a closed question. That was what I was asking for feedback on, around, you know, what's your, you know, if you do engage with digital, what are your priorities? Asking what makes it meaningful and worth doing for teaching staff, you know, about whether it's student learning or, you know, there's various things we could try there. But I do agree, it's a survey, and it becomes quite difficult to ask questions about purpose and function. And we are aware of those limits. I wanted to just flag a kind of, you know, low-level indicator, but it does seem to be quite robust, that teaching staff seem to be happier with the professional development they get at the earlier stages in their career, if they've been around at an institution a short time or in their role a short time, which sort of makes sense, doesn't it? But it seems to tie in with this issue of sustainability over time, that there seems to be this feeling that there is, you know, there might be a push to get staff when you've got a new VLE, for example, a new platform, or when you're new in a role, there's a bit of a push to maybe address some of these issues. But what people are lacking is that follow-up, that sustained engagement, that consistency, that coming back and asking, how was it for you? What would you like to try now? And obviously that's partly a resourcing issue, but, you know, I think it is also it's a planning issue as well. It could be done better, couldn't it?
I think that's interesting as well, John, your point about your free text responses saying staff wanted more digital training, but they prefer a non-digital delivery for this. And I think it's sort of that real challenge, isn't it? Because we know that the value that staff get from coming together face to face, having that hands-on support, being able to discuss it with colleagues, as opposed to, you know, sending them off to an online training module to do in isolation. And it's a hard one in terms of scalability and balance. And perhaps it's almost getting staff to that tipping point where they feel, you know, initially it is bringing them together face to face, but perhaps once their confidence develops, it may be that there is, you know, the online training becomes more sort of acceptable to them, particularly if perhaps there is, you know, there is a space, I don't know, one afternoon where, you know, people can just come together for a couple of hours or face to face if need be, or online, to share the challenges and experiences that they're having with their online training. But it is such a challenging one.
I think it's interesting. I wonder if there's cynicism to certain types of digital, like we're talking here about online pay slips. If they perceive it's something done to basically that institution can make things cheaper, like an estate, like once people used to go into a travel agent, now they have to do it online. You're doing the work, the admin for the organization. So is digital adding something new, or is it just basically a way to make things easier for the other side? Might make, you know, that maybe that's the perception, you know.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I was just thinking of going back to that training. I was just thinking of the Sept idea, which I'm hoping everyone knows about, the idea Duke of York Award, and just the huge response rate that people have had across all age groups, across all different areas, just because of the really engaging way, you know, people self-motivated or encouraged to do it. But it's almost also, again, the nature of the online training that can also influence the take-up. And again, incentives, you know, people are being incentivized by whether it be digital badges or linking through to appraisal or having some incentive to do the training, and how that's then followed up on. And this is very much what's coming through from our work we're doing with institutions on our digital capability discovery tool. You know, it has to be linked. There has to be some purpose. It has to be fed back. It's not just something staff are going to do for the sake of it. And there's some really, really interesting, thought-provoking issues in there, and not that we have the answers yet.
Just keeping up all the comments here. When I'll group these and we'll send these out afterwards.
Oh, I love that.
Take a look.
So I love that, what you said. The incentives aren't just you get an email telling you off when you haven't done it.
Yeah.
Hate those emails. I'm guilty of it when we get those. Have you done your health and safety online training? And you've grown, don't you?
Yeah.
You've got to make it fun, and you know, learning has always got to be fun. It's always got to be giving you some purpose, hasn't it? And I think that's the bit that staff often don't get to see because of all the responsibilities and everything.
I'm yet to see a manual handling course that's fun though, online. I don't think it's possible.
I love that. Office walks by Digital Champions, a highly rated training support approach. That's fantastic. Yes, and I'd absolutely echo that. It's making it meaningful, it's adding it to practice, and it's having that support from colleagues. Peer coaching, yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
See, this is not online, is it? This is all about interactions with colleagues and creating that buzz around professional practice. And I think that's where we are seeing, you know, cases where, you know, I think institutions are moving in the right direction and getting that sort of buy-in from staff. Is it's not when it's just about technology, it's got to be rooted in professional practice, and technology is just one aspect of that. And I think that's, you know, that's the key message that we still need to be pushing. It is all about making, you know, being the best teachers that we can, being the best innovators in terms of the curriculum and the practice that we have access to.
Thanks everyone. So we've got, sorry Helen, we've got 5 minutes left on your last slide on issues to ponder. There's been so much coming in that it's been hard for me to sort of go through the themes. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of this has been covered in the discussion. You know, I mean, I think actually in some ways some of the things that have come up are more interesting than this. But I just wanted to highlight, and actually Tabitha and I were talking about this together.
Oh, Helen, you've gone off there.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
I don't know why my connection's coming and going. There's some apparent paradoxes that you all have spotted, I'm sure, in your own data and tried to explain. And these aren't the only ones, because, as I said, Tabitha and I were discussing these just before we came on. But, you know, that kind of core one, that HE staff, as I mentioned earlier, having better infrastructure, better access, but not carrying out as many teaching activities. And I think we've knocked that one around a little bit. And, you know, we have different ideas about it, cultural, but also to do with the nature of learning, but also, as various people have highlighted, the specific questions we're asking may not be bringing some digital activities to the fore, and we really need to think about that in the question review. The one about teaching staff in FE being more likely to turn to colleagues, specifically teaching colleagues, and a few people hypothesise, well, maybe there's fewer specialist staff and so they have to turn to teaching colleagues. I love Sarah's explanation about the actual spaces that people are working in might be playing a role there, which I'm sure is true. And then I think there's looking across the other surveys, there's the one about students being more positive than teaching staff, both about their digital skills development and about the digital environment, even though objectively they seem to have poorer access than teaching staff. And I think whatever the reason for that, I'll just go back to the fact that that makes teaching staff a fantastically useful resource. If an organisation wants to change and improve the digital environment for teaching and learning, teaching staff at every stage of their career are really useful to that. I don't know if I've got time to mention something that's just coming through. I don't know if I'm allowed, that might be coming through from the professional staff survey, and I hope Tabitha can come in here. We haven't tested this back, so it is, but it does seem that professional staff in FE are not as engaging in so many professional digital activities, perhaps, as their HE counterparts, which would make sense if for professional staff, the digital environment is key. So the digital environment makes it a bit harder, a bit less, straightforward to engage with some of these activities. So if you're a member of professional staff, that's what limits your engagement with, for example, sharing practice online. But when you look at learners, at students and teaching staff, that is turned on its head. So in FE, learners and teaching staff seem to be engaging more. Now, for all the issues that it might be an artifact of the specific questions we've asked, and I completely take that on board, it may be that there's something about the culture of learning and teaching in FE which is driving digital teaching and learning over and above what the environment is supporting. It may be that teaching staff are going out of their way to protect students from the problems that the environment would otherwise offer to them. It may be that there's just been a much longer and more deeply embedded culture of teaching with technology, of digital champions, of that being a core, of a core concern for the digital student experience, for example. So I'm just, I think you can probably see where I'm going with that one. There does seem possibly to be something in the culture or the strategy that's not about the infrastructure at all that is driving a greater engagement with teaching and learning with digital. And I just would leave that as a question as to whether that's defensible and what the reasons might be.
Thanks, Helen. That's great. Thanks for that. Just seen the comment coming from Lena, the one about you find it astonishing that students are more involved, or say they're more involved with decision making than staff. I think, Kate, your response about how in reality, or the perception of that students need to be involved in decision making, and maybe teaching staff are, whether it's in reality or not, are left out of that loop.
I mean, I think it started out to be the original purpose of these surveys, is to actually encourage this as being an initial step in terms of raising awareness, both of staff and students, getting involved in the dialogue, and then, focus group, follow-up conversations, start to dig down in the detail at a local level. And I think a lot of it is about perception. I think it is about, certainly for students, we are seeing institutions now having electronic sort of signs up around the institution saying, you told us last year, we did. Are we going to do the same with staff? Are we going to take some of the findings from, at a local level in institutions from staff and say, you told us this, we've done this, to actually, communicate that and to make them feel valued and engaged and part of this ongoing dialogue. So I think, a lot of the things that we say about students and closing that loop with feedback, I think we also need to have some recommendations in here for staff as well, to say, what are the next steps? How do we inform? How do we build? How do we develop? How do we make staff feel more engaged?
I think the point that Kate makes in there is true and stuff is good, but the timetables of teaching staff are so packed. Even if they wanted to get involved, where is the time to actually do it? Even with good intentions, but it's something that needs to be, highlighted.
Definitely. And I think, there is some good practice that we see going around different institutions where, there is some great engagement.
Yeah.
Go through the institutions are represented on this webinar as well. But, sector-wide, it's a challenge.
So thanks everyone for your comments. I'm conscious that we run out of time. We could easily go on, as usual, much longer than this. It's 3 o'clock. So we're currently finalising the teaching staff report, so incorporate your comments and suggestions. The plan is the findings will be presented at our next community of practice, which is at Staffordshire University on the 6th of November. And you've got a link there. I don't think it's up, or it's going to be up in the next day or two, a link where you can actually book places on there. So please do come along to Staffordshire, where you'll be able to see the results. We're hoping to have the paper copies ready by then, but we can't guarantee it yet because we're on a pretty tight time scale. So I just wanted to say thanks everyone. Sarah, did you want to say any more, or?
Just say yes, please. If you have got any further feedback, Liz, I know you've popped that in the chat window. Yes, please do drop us an email. For us, it's the most valuable thing to have your insights and your comments to make sure we can really refine the report and make sure the recommendations really can help drive the agenda forward. So any further comments, let us know. And just so such a big thank you for your time today and such valuable insights as well. It really helps us to shape what we do.
Thanks. I'd like to second that as well, what Sarah said. And I will, once it comes through, I'll send you the recordings and also the chat room as well. And it's going to be quite a bit to get through there. So thanks everyone for your time. It's really appreciated, and speak soon. Take care.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.